morning. We're here today with Judge Stephen R. GEROFF from the Court of Common Pleas of the First Judicial District of Pennsylvania. Good morning, Judge.
Good morning, Len. Nice to be here.
Thank you, and it's our pleasure that you would come and help out with this project.
I'm going to enjoy it a lot. I know that.
Good. I think it's best to start at the beginning. So can you tell us something about your background and your early life?
Sure. I was born in Strawberry Mansion. Lived there till I was about 7 years old. I lived in a household with I'm an only child. I lived with my mom, my dad, and both my grandparents on a street that was very small, Page Street, and it was the size of a page. Right across the street was the park, and that was our playground. And the kids, we just had a great time in Fairmount Park. It was wonderful. When I was 7, we moved to Oxford Circle, and I spent the rest of my life till I got married living in Oxford Circle. My first school in Strawberry Mansion was Stokely School, the elementary school. I went to Solace Cohen when we moved to Oxford Circle, Wilson Junior High, and then Central High School for my high school education.
Did you say Central High School?
I did. My class was at 209.
I was wondering whether you were going to say that. So you, at some point after college, after high school, you decided to go to college.
Well, that was the plan all along. It was the plan from day one with my mom and dad.
And so where did you decide, or where was the decision made?
All right, well, let me say this. My dad was a working man. My mom was a full-time mom. I went where there was a scholarship. And I had a full pay scholarship to Temple.
Wow.
Partial pay to other schools. So I went to Temple.
Yeah.
And I'm happy I did.
Well, that's great. That's great. And you decided to study law while you were in college,
Well, I was an English major. I had no thought of going to law school until fortuitously I had one of my teachers was Judge Nicholas Cipriani. I took a business law class.
Yeah.
Oh, what a man.
Yeah, I agree.
And once I met Judge Cipriani and saw his love of the law, and he just instilled it in me. He really, really did. I wanted to go on to take a master's in English and PhD in English. I wanted to teach English. But once I met Judge Cipriani, things changed for me, and I did want to become a lawyer.
Yeah, he's like the gentleman of the Philadelphia courts.
He was as good as they come.
Yeah.
As good as they come, true.
I was happy to call him my friend, too. And so you went to Temple.
I did for 4 years.
And then
took the subway every day of my life. Every day of my life to high school, 4 years at Temple undergrad, 3 years at Temple Law School, subway regular.
Yeah, it sounds it. You probably had a rented spot on one of the cars.
Pretty much.
And so after that, you began an association with a series of different law firms. Is that right?
Well, here's what happened. When I graduated law school, and I was very fortunate that when I graduated, jobs were plentiful. It was not hard to find a good job. And I also was lucky enough to have had a nice standing in my class. In those days, the first thing you had to do was satisfy a 6-month clerkship. It's not like today when you graduate law school, pass the bar, and you're admitted. In those days, you had to serve a clerkship that lasted 6 months before you could be admitted to the bar, even if you had passed the bar exam.
Okay.
So I took my clerkship. I served my clerkship with different lawyers. One was a lawyer whose specialty was orphans court work in Montgomery County. His name was Florindo Fortunato Tronsolidi. I had trouble writing that on one line. Um, and I worked for him, I clerked for him for a whole summer. Uh, and and he was a wonderful man. He was so nice to me. But I was convinced that orphans court work was something I did not want to do.
Yeah, it's an unusual area of the law.
It was, and I found it boring, to be perfectly honest. Uh, Then I served an additional clerkship with a firm, Winokur and Kahn. They were wonderful. They were personal injury attorneys. And then my first real job as a lawyer was with the firm of Becker and Becker.
Oh.
This was Judge Becker, his dad, and his brother-in-law, Lou Fryman. And that's where I first got a job as a lawyer.
Okay. At what point did you, well, I think while we're still talking about your early law career, maybe I could ask you the question that I mentioned earlier about how do you think the practice of law is different now from the practice of law then when you were just beginning?
I can't speak authoritatively because I can only speak from my own impressions, obviously.
Sure.
But I think there is a loss of collegiality between lawyers that used to exist when I was a young lawyer. I found that even the older lawyers, treated me so well back then. Nobody was, there was not an adversarial situation between lawyers.
Yes.
Your adversary was not your enemy. Your adversary was your friend. And that's the way law was practiced when I started. I can tell you a little anecdote. I still
Sure.
remember I'm a very young lawyer, and the firm sends me over to handle a small claims matter in municipal court. Then the jurisdiction was $300. That was the maximum.
Okay.
And they started at 3:30 in the afternoon. And we all sat in the jury box in a room that was really a CP room, but they used it for the municipal court.
Yeah.
The municipal court afternoon sessions. So the lawyers are all in a jury box, and I'm sitting next to a lawyer who had to be 70 years old. And I introduced myself to him, he introduced himself to me. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, when I'm 70, I hope I'm not handling a $300 matter. I do remember that. That was vivid, and that is still vivid in my memory.
I imagine that. I imagine with that collegiality, it was probably, and this is a total guess on my part, easier to reach an agreement or settlement.
Generally speaking, it was.
Yeah.
I can't think of everybody's name now because so much time has gone by.
Yeah.
But I can think of the firms, White and Williams. What a wonderful firm to have on the other side. Reasonable people who saw things the right way.
Okay.
I can think of a couple of guys here. Joe Foster, what a man.
Yeah.
Joe Pinto. Joe passed away about 5 years ago.
Oh,
Another wonderful lawyer. And most of my matters with White and Williams were with those two, and always had a good relationship with them.
Oh, that's great and effective, I would think. So, I know you worked for the district attorney's office.
Well, let me tell you how I got there. Okay.
Okay.
What happened? I was with the Becker firm for a little less than 2 years, and my specialty was legal writing when I started out. I was some kind of good writer. I've lost that ability over the years, but I really was a good writer back then. I put an ad in the Legal Intelligencer, and I remember word for word, young attorney seeks job with emphasis on legal writing. And I got a handwritten note that I wish I had kept from Justice Herbert Cohen, Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And my box number was H23, and it just said, "Dear Box H23, call me, Herb Cohen." And I became the law clerk to the Supreme Court Justice that way. We had a great relationship.
Yeah.
And I stayed with him for more than the usual period of time that law clerks stay with Supreme Court justices. And he paved the way for me to get first a job. First job I had after I left him was with Elwood Levy. Elwood Levy was considered a giant in the personal injury community back then. He had just left the firm of Richter, Lord and Levy. They had a nasty breakup. And I went with Woody, as he was called. And I learned an awful lot from him. He was the toughest taskmaster a young lawyer could have, but the best teacher a young lawyer could have. He was a man, and I learned a lot from him, and actually got to handle and try very, very important cases. But what happened was, initially when I was with him, there was a case that originated from York County. Justice Cohen was from York County. And there was a claim that originated against General Motors. And while I was with Justice Cohen, I would, in the evenings, moonlight at a law office where I did legal briefs. A claim came into them against General Motors for a young girl who was rendered a quadriplegic, 20-year-old beautiful girl. When a Buick turned over and the roof collapsed. Long story short, the firm realized that it belonged elsewhere than in York County. I went to Philadelphia and started my career with Elwood Levy, and that firm, that case came with me. It was not my case. I didn't have the money to fund that case. It was Woody's case, but I got to work on that case. What Woody had me doing was research, and that was fine for a while. But I wanted to try cases, and I left Woody and wound up in the DA's office, which I loved. I could have made a career there, but after being in the DA's office for 2 years, I got the biggest compliment that I ever received when I got a phone call from Woody and said, "Steve, I want you back on your terms."
Really?
You can try cases, and you can develop your own practice, with no restrictions. So I could not turn that deal down. So I did return to Woody, got to try that claim against General Motors, and it set new law. It was the first case where product liability under 402A, strict liability, of the restatement of torts was applied to defective design, not defective manufacture. It set the law across the country. And I was able to try that case, and it was very, very rewarding for me.
Well, congratulations.
And I don't mean financially. I mean, professionally.
Right. Sure. Now, you mentioned Mr. Levy, Woody Levy, as being a giant of the law. Now, were there other individuals whom you admired? Or
I did. When I was in the DA's office, I was assigned for a long time to a Cecil Moore program. I don't know how many people still remember Cecil Moore, but he was as good a criminal lawyer as there ever was. And I learned so much from him. I tried about 50 cases against Cecil Moore. And in the beginning, he wiped the floor up with me. But as time went along, I learned his shtick.
He was quite a flamboyant
and I know how to handle him. On one occasion, because he was tough to control in a courtroom, the judge was Judge Spaeth, who was one of the most brilliant judges I ever knew. Judge Spaeth held him in contempt and told him he was going to spend the night in jail. And he did. He spent the night in jail. Cecil, who well, let me tell you what happened. Never to be outdone by anyone, Cecil returned the next morning and said, "Your Honor, I want to thank you for sending me to jail overnight. I have 10 new clients as a result." That's what happened.
Class.
Yeah. So there were others. When I was in law school, we used to come to City Hall to watch Charles Prudo.
Uh-huh. Sure.
He taught us, watching him, how to handle criminal cases. And he would meet with us in the hallway and answer questions. He was a teacher. He really was. He was.
Well, that's
I
great, isn't
admired
it?
him greatly.
Yeah.
We used to watch Nathan Richter. Nate Richter was called the King of Torts in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And he was a master at distracting the jury from the defense case. I remember sitting in the courtroom, and in that courtroom there was a water cooler in the back of the room. And while the defense was putting on its expert, Mr. Richter got up from his from counsel table,
Yeah.
walked to the back of the room to get a cup of water, and all the jurors turned to watch him. Masterful.
Yeah.
There was a criminal lawyer named Louis Lipschitz. Louis
Yeah.
Lipschitz.
Right.
We used to call him Grandpa Stroman. He looked like Grandpa
Oh,
Stroman.
yeah.
And he was also masterful. What
Yeah.
he could do, I've never seen anyone else do. Louis, we have to realize, was a wonderful and experienced criminal attorney. He would stand in front of the jury to deliver his closing argument and would tremble as though he were so nervous he didn't know what to do, and tears came down his cheeks. He could make himself cry. What an actor and great lawyer. Yeah, so there were just some
Right.
of us, and I was fortunate enough to try cases with Louis, and I was very lucky.
Well, that's great. That's really great. Thanks for those stories. You know, earlier we talked about how there was a difference in the level of collegiality in the practice of law when you first began and the practice of law now. I wonder, is there a similar, or do you find there are other differences in the courtroom, or was that reflected in your earlier?
Well, when I practiced, I found certain judges were very, very formal. That is not my style.
Right. Okay.
I believe the less formality, the better. I don't want people to be intimidated coming into my courtroom.
Right. Okay.
My courtroom is 707. We refer to it as courthouse heaven. I try my best to make people feel comfortable in my room. That wasn't always so when I practiced law. There were judges who were so formal that I felt uncomfortable
Right. Okay.
being in their courtrooms. But that's not true across the board. There were
Right.
those judges who did make you feel comfortable.
I think that actually tends to be important from the public standpoint, because part of the ideal of access to justice is that there shouldn't be any detrimental effects to discourage people from taking cases or from participating in cases.
Well, yeah, we try our best to make sure that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, even the best efforts can be overcome by posses in the courtroom. And if you know what I mean, there was just an example of that in the paper the other day.
Witness intimidation.
Yeah, witness intimidation, where there was a report, it might have been last week or Saturday's Inquirer,
Mm-hmm.
where a fellow who was shot in the face, who identified the defendant as his shooter to the police,
Right.
who identified the defender as his shooter at the preliminary hearing, and who took the witness stand, and as the article in the newspaper indicated, with 2 rows filled with friends and relatives of the defendant. When asked by the DA, do you see the fellow who shot you in the courtroom? And he said no.
Right.
The jury acquitted him.
Okay.
Acquitted the defendant.
Yeah.
So you can't always accomplish what you want by
No.
by trying to make it a comfortable place to
No,
do.
of course not. And that's a huge problem in the court system today.
Today it is.
Yeah.
I know that we're trying to deal with it. It's awfully hard to overcome.
Right. I was wondering, did you have anything that or maybe any cases, aside from your precedent-setting case earlier that you mentioned? Are there any other cases since you've been a judge, maybe, or any
Sure.
other
Well,
cases?
there's some cases that I'm particularly proud of.
Yeah,
One that my secretary knows very, very well, and she's here watching.
yeah.
I represented a young man who was accused of vehicular homicide while DUI.
Mhm.
Tragically, a 13-year-old little boy died. And he fled the scene. My client did the most foolish thing he could have done.
Right.
After the boy was hit, he fled the scene on foot and was caught by the police trying to rent a car at a Ford agency. Long story short, that went to trial, and he was acquitted of all the charges except leaving the scene, which when I argued to the jury, I said, I'm not going to tell you that he didn't leave the scene.
Yeah.
And clearly, he's guilty of that.
Right.
And the judge at the time was a very tough judge, and he was upset with the jury verdict acquitting him of the other offenses.
Yeah.
So he sentenced him to the maximum he could give him for leaving the scene, and that was 11.5 to 23 months, 1 to 2 years. But he wanted him in the county jail so he could keep him there as long as he wanted. As a result of that,
Make a career
the
out
law
of it.
was changed, and now if there's a DUI that results in a homicide and you flee, in fact, if you flee the scene of a vehicular accident where a homicide results, is a mandatory minimum sentence.
Oh.
So that did change the law too.
Yeah.
As a judge, I handled what I consider a case that I enjoyed. I don't know that the victims did. There was a fellow charged with serial rapes. His method of proceeding would be he adopted several aliases. He pretended to be a physician at Hahnemann Hospital, even had ID that got him in and out of the hospital, made him look like he really was a physician.
Gee.
He had another alter ego of he was a flight surgeon. He pretended to be an astronaut, and he had identification for all of this, very professionally made.
Yeah.
And he fooled these girls. What he did was, he put he would go on one of the online dating services and would meet women in Center City, but he made sure that they would have to drive in from a suburban location. And when they got here, he would meet them he'd tell them where to park. They would go over to a local restaurant or bar,
Yeah.
and they would go to powder their nose, which he knew they would have to do because they had just driven in from the suburbs.
Oh, I see.
And meanwhile, they would have ordered a drink, and when they came back, the woman would take her drink, and invariably she would fall asleep. He would take her back to his place and do what he wanted. Anyway, so he was acquitted of almost all those charges, but found guilty on 2. And I sentenced him to the maximum I could, which was something like 10 to 20 years. It wasn't enough.
Yeah.
But he made this mistake. He committed the same crime in Idaho. And Idaho, unfortunately for him, has a mandatory life sentence for a subsequent sex offender. So he's now on his PCRAs and he's representing himself, and he's a bright young man, but anyway. So on that case, I did receive a phone call from an attorney representing a movie producer who was thinking of turning that into a movie.
Oh.
And I said, I'm happy to help, but I think the judge ought to be played by Richard Gere. But
Naturally, that's what I
never
would've
got
thought.
Yeah, I know. It never got made into a movie. but it's been the subject of a 2020 hour-long program.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it has.
Okay.
And there were some others. I had some. I had the double homicide, the saddest case, where two wonderful, hardworking people. It was the dollar store murder. They were assassinated.
Yeah.
Assassinated by vicious people, and the double homicide on Delaware Avenue, where there was actually occurred on two separate occasions. These fellows drove in from Trenton, committed a robbery at a nightclub on Delaware Avenue, which is no longer in existence, and killed someone to make sure everybody understood that they meant business and they got money and jewelry.
Yeah.
Well, 3 weeks later, they came back and did the same
No.
thing. You know, exact same MO. Fortunately or unfortunately, the police who were surveilling the place, thinking that this might happen again,
Yeah.
weren't paying careful enough attention and didn't know this was going on until someone already had been shot. But they did catch them fleeing at that point.
Well,
So,
that's-
yeah.
Yeah, at least that.
But you know, I've had some interesting cases.
Yeah, it sounds like
yeah.
kind of frightening cases. Yeah.
And the woman who was originally accused of third-degree murder, eventually after 3 trials, 2 mistrials caused by hung juries, was convicted of involuntary manslaughter,
Yeah.
shaken baby syndrome.
Oh,
She was the
okay.
caretaker
One of
of a
those.
3-year-old little boy. But the interesting thing was she was very well-to-do, and listed as a character witness, Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah happened to have been in town at the time filming the movie on an old city. I can't think of the name of the movie. But of course, Oprah never showed up as a character
Okay,
witness, but she
right.
was on the list. So anyway,
I've often wondered or been happy that I was not a judge sitting in those sorts of cases and having to make decisions involving life and death and
well, that decision is on the part of the jury. All I have to do is instruct them properly.
right.
So the jury's the one. I've had a couple of death penalties in my room.
Mm-hmm.
One of which I completely disagreed with. I couldn't believe the jury sentenced this poor young man to death. And after 7 years, the Commonwealth withdrew, even though he had been sentenced to death.
Yeah.
The Commonwealth did withdraw the death penalty, so he's now serving a life sentence.
Okay.
So the other fellow who deserved the death penalty,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court reversed, saying that I allowed the DA to make an argument I shouldn't have allowed him to make, so now he's serving life too.
Okay. Well, is there anything else at this point you'd like to tell us about yourself or?
Well, let me say that this. What I believe in lasting relationships.
Yeah.
I believe that a marriage is a marriage, and I believe when you hire people, they should be hired for a long time. So,
Right.
my secretary's been with me for 31 years.
Here's to Joanne.
Joanne Marin.
Okay.
People refer to us as our daytime spouses. That's what we are. Also,
And I know Joanne is very capable.
extremely,
Yeah.
and truthfully, without her, I don't know what I would do. My first law clerk was with me for about 16 years,
Yeah.
but he retired. He's actually older than I am. Wonderful man, and great law clerk, Wally Dyer. And when I went on the bench, we had court reporters who were assigned to judges.
Right.
So my first court reporter, Stanley Wilder, who
Mhm.
was one of my best friends, was with me for probably about 15 years also before
Mhm.
he retired. So I believe in lasting relationships. My next law clerk has been with me since Wally retired. It's Maureen, and Maureen is wonderful. And I just believe in keeping people who are good and not changing law clerks,
I
not
agree.
changing people who work for you. They're doing a good job. please let them stay with you.
Exactly.
So
That's a good idea.
that's my approach.
Okay.
I'm more comfortable that way than I would be with changing a law clerk every year or two.
Well, it stands to reason, yeah. Well, we'd like to thank Judge Stephen R. GEROFF of the Court of Common Pleas of the First Judicial District of Pennsylvania. And I appreciate your coming down here today.
And as I said at the beginning, it is my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Judge.
All right, you're welcome.